A 9-year-old girl trapped in a wheelchair. A 7-year-old boy with eyes that see what others miss. When wealth meets poverty in the sprawling Sterling mansion, an innocent friendship uncovers a truth so devastating it threatens to shatter everything. What secret has kept Sophia Sterling paralyzed since birth? And why does young Tommy sense something terribly wrong? Before you finish this story, your heart will break and then soar. Like and comment if you believe every child deserves the truth. The first time Tommy Chen saw Sophia Sterling, she was crying behind the rose garden, her wheelchair positioned carefully beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree that had witnessed generations of Sterling family secrets. It was a Thursday morning in late September, when autumn had just begun painting the Massachusetts landscape in shades of amber and gold. Tommy, barely 7 years old with perpetually dirt-stained hands and second-hand clothes that hung loose on his thin frame, had been working alongside his mother in the Sterling estate gardens for 3 months. His mother, Lin Chen, had taken the groundskeeper position after Tommy's father died in a construction accident, leaving them with nothing but medical debt and shattered dreams. The job came with a small cottage on the estate grounds, and enough money to keep them fed, though barely. Tommy had been taught to stay invisible, to keep his head down, to never speak unless spoken to by the Sterling family. But something about the sound of that little girl's sobs, raw and desperate, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep inside, made him forget every rule his mother had drilled into him. "Are you okay?" Tommy asked softly, stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to walk away. The girl's head snapped up, revealing a face streaked with tears and framed by long dark hair that fell in perfect waves despite her distress. Her eyes were an unusual shade of green, like sea glass catching sunlight, and they widened with surprise at seeing him there. She wore an expensive lavender dress with lace trim, the kind Tommy had only seen in store windows, and her wheelchair gleamed with chrome that probably cost more than his mother earned in a year. "Who are you?" Sophia Sterling demanded, quickly wiping her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself into the poised young lady she'd been trained to be since birth. "I'm Tommy. My mom works here. In the gardens." He gestured vaguely toward the elaborate flower beds his mother tended with such care. "I help sometimes." "You shouldn't be back here," Sophia said, but her voice lacked conviction. There was something in her eyes, a loneliness so profound it made Tommy's chest ache, that contradicted her words. "Why were you crying?" Tommy asked, ignoring her dismissal. He'd never been good at following rules anyway, a trait his mother both worried about and secretly admired. Sophia's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Today's my birthday. I'm 9 years old. And do you know what my father gave me? A new medical team, more doctors. More specialists who will poke and prod and tell me the same thing they've told me my entire life. That I'll never walk. That I was born like this, and there's nothing anyone can do." Tommy tilted his head, studying her with the unfiltered curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide his thoughts. "Were you really born like that?" The question hung in the air between them, strange and almost accusatory, though Tommy hadn't meant it that way. Something flickered across Sophia's face. Confusion, perhaps, or the shadow of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "Of course I was," she said, but her voice wavered. "That's what everyone says. My father, the doctors, Mrs. Pemberton, she's my nanny. They all say I was born with a spinal condition, that I've never walked, never even stood on my own." "Do you remember being a baby?" Tommy asked, stepping closer and crouching down so they were at eye level. His knees pressed into the soft grass, still damp with morning dew. "Nobody remembers being a baby," Sophia replied, but uncertainty crept into her tone. "I remember some things," Tommy said thoughtfully. "I remember my dad's laugh. I remember him throwing me up in the air and catching me. I was maybe 3 or 4. Do you remember anything like that before the wheelchair? For the—" Sophia opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Her brow furrowed as she searched her memories, reaching back through years of hospital visits and physical therapy sessions and pitying looks from everyone she'd ever met. "I remember. Sometimes I dream about running. Is that weird? I dream about running through grass and feeling the sun on my face and my legs working perfectly. But those are just dreams. They don't mean anything. Or maybe they're memories, Tommy suggested, with the simple logic of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned to dismiss the impossible. Before Sophia could respond, a sharp voice cut through the peaceful garden sanctuary. "Sophia Marie Sterling, what are you doing out here alone? And who is this child?" A tall woman in a crisp grey suit strode toward them with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to complete authority. Mrs. Harriet Pemberton had been Sophia's nanny since birth, a stern woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She positioned herself between Tommy and Sophia like a shield, her body language screaming disapproval. "I was just talking to him," Sophia said quickly. "He works here. His name is Tommy." "Staff children are not permitted to interact with Miss Sterling," Mrs. Pemberton said coldly, directing her words at Tommy with a look that could freeze summer itself. "Your mother will be hearing about this. Now leave immediately." Tommy stood his ground, which surprised everyone, including himself. "I was just making sure she was okay. She was crying." "Miss Sterling's emotional state is none of your concern," Mrs. Pemberton snapped, gripping the handles of Sophia's wheelchair. "If I catch you near her again, your mother will lose her position here. Do you understand?" Tommy looked past Mrs. Pemberton to Sophia, whose face had gone pale. In her eyes he saw a desperate plea, not for him to leave, but for him to stay, to not be another person who abandoned her to her loneliness. But he also saw fear that his mother would lose the job that kept them housed and fed. "I understand," Tommy said quietly, backing away. As Mrs. Pemberton wheeled Sophia back toward the main house, a sprawling Georgian mansion with more rooms than any family could possibly need, Tommy watched them go. But what he noticed made his stomach twist with confusion. Just for a moment, when Mrs. Pemberton had first started moving the wheelchair, Sophia's left foot had twitched. It was barely perceptible, a small involuntary movement that lasted only a second. But Tommy had seen it clearly. He didn't understand what it meant, but some instinct told him it was important. Very important. That night, as Tommy lay in his small bed in the cottage he shared with his mother, he couldn't stop thinking about Sophia Sterling, about her tears and her loneliness and her dreams of running, about that tiny movement he'd witnessed, about the question that kept circling through his young mind: what if everyone was wrong? The next morning, Tommy made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He would watch Sophia Sterling carefully. He would pay attention to things that others missed. And somehow, some way, he would find out the truth. Because something in the Sterling mansion was terribly, terribly wrong. The Sterling mansion sat on 47 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, a monument to wealth that had been accumulated over 4 generations. Richard Sterling, Sophia's father, had inherited a fortune built on banking and real estate, then multiplied it through tech investments that had proven eerily prescient. At 45, he was one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, known for his charitable donations, his ruthless business acumen, and his devotion to his paralyzed daughter. Or so everyone believed. Tommy learned these facts slowly over the following weeks, piecing together information from conversations between staff members, from whispered gossip among the housekeepers, from his mother's careful explanations of why they needed to be grateful for their position, despite the strict rules that governed their lives on the estate. What fascinated Tommy most wasn't the money or the mansion or even the famous people who sometimes visited. It was Sophia herself and the mystery that seemed to surround her like morning fog. He'd been warned repeatedly to stay away from her. Mrs. Pemberton had made good on her threat, reporting him to his mother, who had gripped his shoulders with trembling hands and begged him to follow the rules. Lin Chen couldn't afford to lose this job. There were no other options, no safety net, nothing but the terrifying prospect of homelessness if they were dismissed from the Sterling estate. So Tommy watched from a distance instead. He became a shadow in the gardens, learning Sophia's routines with the dedication of a young detective. Every day at 10 in the morning, Mrs. Pemberton would wheel Sophia out to the terrace for what they called fresh air time. At noon, a physical therapist would arrive for exercises that seemed to accomplish nothing. At 3 o'clock, private tutors would come and go, teaching Sophia in isolation from other children. She had no friends, no play dates, no classmates. Her entire world existed within the walls and gardens of the Sterling estate, bounded by her wheelchair and the adults who controlled every aspect of her life. It had been 3 weeks since their first encounter when Tommy finally got his second chance to speak with Sophia. Mrs. Pemberton had been called away for an emergency phone call, leaving Sophia alone on the terrace for what was supposed to be only a few minutes. Tommy seized the opportunity with the fearlessness of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned to calculate risk properly. "Hi," he said simply, appearing from behind a large potted plant where he'd been supposedly weeding. Sophia's face lit up with genuine joy before she remembered to school her expression into something more reserved. "You're going to get in trouble again." "So am I, probably." "Maybe," Tommy agreed, dropping down to sit cross-legged on the terrace stones. "But I wanted to ask you something. Have you ever tried to walk when nobody's watching?" The question clearly startled her. "What? No, I can't walk. I've told you that." "But have you tried?" Tommy pressed. "Like, actually tried when you're alone?" Sophia's face flushed with something that might have been embarrassment or anger or confusion. "I'm paralyzed, Tommy. Paralyzed people can't just try harder and suddenly walk. That's not how it works." "I know that," Tommy said patiently, "but your foot moved. That day in the garden. I saw it. And I've been watching you when you don't know I'm looking. Sometimes your legs move a little, like tiny twitches. If you were completely paralyzed, would that happen?" The color drained from Sophia's face. "You're imagining things." "I have really good eyes," Tommy insisted. "My dad used to say I noticed stuff other people missed." He said it was like a superpower. His voice caught slightly when he mentioned his father, but he pushed through. "And I'm not imagining it. I've seen your feet move at least 5 times now. Not big movements, but movements." Sophia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes I feel things. In my legs. Like pins and needles. Or little sparks. But Mrs. Pemberton says that's just phantom sensations. She says paralyzed people feel them all the time, but they don't mean anything." "What if she's wrong?" Tommy asked. "She can't be wrong. She's been with me since I was born. So have all the doctors. My father pays for the best specialists in the world. They've done every test imaginable. They all say the same thing." Tommy leaned forward, his young face intense with conviction. "Then why do you have dreams about running? Real memories don't come from nowhere, Sophia. What if something else is going on? What if—" "Miss Sterling!" Mrs. Pemberton's voice rang out across the terrace like a gunshot. She appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with fury. "You boy! I warned you!" What happened next occurred so quickly that Tommy barely processed it. Mrs. Pemberton rushed toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. Tommy scrambled to his feet, preparing to run, but as Mrs. Pemberton reached for Sophia's wheelchair, clearly intending to pull her away, Sophia did something that froze everyone in place. She leaned forward suddenly, her body shifting as if to stand, and for just a fraction of a second, maybe half a heartbeat, her legs bore her weight. Her feet pressed flat against the wheelchair's footrest with clear intention, muscles engaging in a way that paralyzed limbs absolutely could not do. Then she collapsed back into the seat, her face a mask of shock and confusion, as if her own body had betrayed a secret she didn't know she was keeping. Mrs. Pemberton's face went white, then red, then white again. "Inside. Now," she commanded, her voice shaking. She grabbed the wheelchair handles and practically ran with Sophia back into the mansion, leaving Tommy standing alone on the terrace. But not before Tommy saw the look in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes. It wasn't surprise, it wasn't curiosity. It was something much more disturbing. It was fear. And beneath that fear was something that looked distinctly like guilt. Tommy returned to his cottage that evening with his mind racing. His mother noticed his distraction during dinner, the way he pushed his rice around his plate without eating, but she attributed it to typical 7-year-old moodiness and didn't press. That night, unable to sleep, Tommy crept to the window and looked out toward the main house. Most of the windows were dark, but one on the second floor remained lit. He knew from careful observation that it was Sophia's room, What was she thinking right now? Had she realized what had happened on the terrace? Did she understand that her legs had moved with purpose, with strength, with intention? More importantly, who else had noticed? The next day, Sophia didn't appear for her usual morning terrace time, or her afternoon tutoring session, or any of her regular routines. Tommy watched the house anxiously, but the wheelchair never emerged. By the third day of Sophia's absence, worry had transformed into something darker in his chest, a cold certainty that something bad was happening. On the fourth day, Tommy saw an ambulance pull up to the mansion's front entrance. His heart nearly stopped. Through the elaborate front doors he watched as EMTs wheeled a gurney inside. 20 minutes later, they emerged with Sophia strapped to it, Mrs. Pemberton walking alongside with a leather folder full of medical documents. Tommy couldn't hear what Mrs. Pemberton was saying to the EMTs, but he could see Sophia's face. She looked terrified. Her eyes darted around desperately, and for just a moment they locked with Tommy's across the vast lawn. In that brief connection, Tommy understood. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was something else. Something wrong. Sophia's eyes were pleading with him, begging him to understand what she herself probably couldn't articulate. The ambulance drove away with lights flashing, but no siren, carrying Sophia to some unknown destination, while Tommy stood frozen among the rose bushes, gripping a gardening trowel so tightly it hurt his hand. That evening, Tommy did something he'd never done before. He lied to his mother. He told her he wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to bed early. Once she'd kissed his forehead and turned out his light, he waited until he heard her shower running, then slipped out of the cottage into the darkness. The Sterling mansion loomed against the night sky, most windows dark, but a few still glowing with warm light. Tommy had spent months studying the property's layout, memorizing which doors were kept locked and which were often left accessible for staff. The service entrance near the kitchen should be open. The night cook always arrived around 8 o'clock and rarely locked the door behind her immediately. Tommy's heart hammered as he tried the handle. It turned easily. He slipped inside, finding himself in a utility hallway that smelled of cleaning supplies and fresh bread. Voices drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, Mr. Sterling's voice, deep and authoritative, and Mrs. Pemberton's higher-pitched tones responding. Moving with the stealth only a determined 7-year-old could muster, Tommy crept toward the voices. He found himself outside Mr. Sterling's study, the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, he could see Mr. Sterling seated behind an enormous desk, Mrs. Pemberton standing before him like a student called to the principal's office. "How many times have I told you to be more careful?" Mr. Sterling was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We cannot have incidents like what happened on that terrace. The medication dosages need to be increased again." "But, sir, we're already at dangerous levels," Mrs. Pemberton protested. The neurologist warned that too much could cause permanent damage to her actual motor functions. "She doesn't have motor functions," Mr. Sterling snapped. "She's paralyzed. That's the entire point. That's what everyone believes, and that's what must continue to be true. Do you understand me, Harriet? Everything we've built depends on maintaining this narrative." "What about the boy? The groundskeeper's son. He's been watching her. He sees things." Mr. Sterling's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "Then we'll need to ensure he and his mother are no longer employed here. Create some reason, theft perhaps, or misconduct. Make sure they leave before the boy can cause any real problems." Tommy's blood ran cold. They were going to fire his mother, make them leave, all because he'd noticed things he wasn't supposed to notice. But far worse than that was the implication of what he'd just heard. Medication, dosages, dangerous levels, maintaining a narrative. Sophia Sterling wasn't naturally paralyzed. Someone was making her that way. Someone was giving her drugs to keep her in that wheelchair. And that someone was her own father. The revelation was so enormous, so impossible, that Tommy's young mind struggled to process it. Why would a father do that to his own daughter? What could possibly motivate such a monstrous act? Tommy carefully backed away from the study door, his whole body trembling. He needed to get out of the house before someone discovered him, but more importantly, he needed to figure out what to do with this terrible knowledge. Who would believe a 7-year-old boy over a billionaire and his entire household staff? As Tommy slipped back out into the night, questions swirled through his mind like a storm. But one thing crystallized with absolute certainty. He had to save Sophia Sterling. Somehow, despite being just a poor kid with no power and no resources, he had to find a way to free her from the prison her own father had created. The truth was even worse than he'd imagined, and the fight to expose it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of Worcester Children's Hospital cast a sterile glow over Sophia Sterling's room as she lay in bed, connected to various monitors that beeped rhythmically in the quiet night. It was her 5th day there, and she'd been subjected to enough tests to last a lifetime. MRIs, CT scans, nerve conduction studies, blood work that left her arms bruised and aching. Every doctor who examined her confirmed what they'd always said. Complete paralysis from the waist down, present since birth, no hope of recovery. The medical records were comprehensive and damning, spanning her entire 9 years of life. They painted a picture of a tragic case, a little girl born with a severe spinal cord malformation that had never responded to any treatment. But something had changed inside Sophia during those 5 days. Ever since that moment on the terrace when her legs had moved, when she'd felt them bear her weight for that brief, impossible instant, doubt had taken root in her mind. Tommy's questions echoed constantly. Have you ever tried to walk when nobody's watching? What if everyone is wrong? Late at night, when the nurses had completed their rounds and she was supposedly sleeping, Sophia had begun to experiment. Small things at first. Concentrating all her focus on her toes, willing them to move. Sometimes nothing happened, but other times, more and more frequently, she felt responses. Tiny twitches. Electrical sensations running down her legs. The sense that something was there, dormant but not dead. The more she tried, the more she noticed another pattern. Every morning and evening, Mrs. Pemberton would arrive with her vitamins, a small paper cup containing 3 different pills that Sophia had taken without question her entire life. But now she observed how drowsy they made her feel, how her legs would go completely numb within an hour of swallowing them, how her mind would fog over as if wrapped in cotton. What if those weren't vitamins at all? On the 6th evening, Sophia made a decision. When Mrs. Pemberton arrived with the medication, Sophia pretended to swallow the pills as usual. But this time she tucked them under her tongue, holding them there until Mrs. Pemberton left, then spitting them out and hiding them in a tissue. The next few hours were unlike anything Sophia had experienced in her conscious memory. As whatever drug had been in her system began to wear off, sensations flooded back into her legs. Not full feeling, not yet, but pins and needles that intensified until they were almost painful. Her feet began to twitch involuntarily. Her knees jerked beneath the blankets. And along with the physical sensations came something else. Fragments of memories she didn't know she had, running through grass, standing at a window watching birds, walking hand in hand with her mother who had died when Sophia was 3 years old, or so she'd been told. But these memories felt different from the dreams she'd dismissed for so long. They felt real, solid, true. Had she once been able to walk? Before her mother died? Before something had changed in the Sterling household? The questions terrified her more than the paralysis itself, because they led to implications too horrible to fully confront. If she'd once been able to walk and now she couldn't, then someone had done this to her deliberately. Someone had taken away her mobility, her freedom, 9 years of her life. Someone had trapped her in a wheelchair and convinced the entire world, including Sophia herself, that she'd been born that way. By the 8th day in the hospital, Sophia's legs were responding more consistently. When she was alone, she could flex her feet, bend her knees slightly, engage muscles she'd forgotten existed. The movements were weak and uncoordinated, but they were undeniably there. She was not paralyzed. She had never been truly paralyzed. She was being poisoned. The realization crashed over her like a wave of ice water. Her father, who claimed to love her more than anything, who had dedicated his wealth to finding treatments for her condition, who wore his role as devoted father to a disabled child like a badge of honor in the media. He was the one doing this to her. The evidence was overwhelming once she allowed herself to see it. His insistence on complete control over her medical care, his isolation of her from other children, his selection of Mrs. Pemberton as her constant guardian. The way he'd reacted with fury rather than joy when her legs had shown signs of working. But why? What possible reason could a father have for crippling his own daughter? Money, perhaps. Sophia knew her father's charitable foundation, centered around disability, advocacy had made him even wealthier through donations and tax benefits. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was about control. Faye's paralyzed daughter would always be dependent, would never leave, would never question his authority. On the 9th day, Dr. Ramirez, the neurologist overseeing her case, came to her room with a serious expression. "Miss Sterling, we're going to be discharging you tomorrow. Your father has arranged for a new treatment program at home with a specialist team. However, I want to speak with you privately first, if that's all right." Sophia nodded, her heart racing. Mrs. Pemberton had stepped out to make a phone call, leaving them alone for the first time since her admission. "Doctor." Ramirez closed the door and sat down beside Sophia's bed. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an air of competence that made Sophia instinctively trust her. "Sophia, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever been able to move your legs even a little bit?" Sophia's breath caught. How did she know? I thought I couldn't. Everyone says I was born paralyzed." "That's not what I asked," Dr. Ramirez said gently. "Have you ever moved your legs? Recently, perhaps?" Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. The need to tell someone, to share this terrible burden with an adult who might actually help, overwhelmed her usual caution. "Yes," she whispered. "When I don't take my vitamins, I can feel them. I can move them a little. Not much, but they work. They actually work." Dr. Ramirez's face went very still. "What vitamins? Who gives them to you?" "Mrs. Pemberton, my nanny. 3 pills twice a day, but they're not vitamins, are they?" "Sophia, I need you to listen very carefully. What you're describing sounds like you've been given neuromuscular blocking agents, medications that temporarily paralyze muscle function. If administered regularly over time, they could create the appearance of permanent paralysis while actually preventing your muscles from working. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Sophia did understand, though part of her mind still refused to fully accept it. "My father is poisoning me. I don't have proof of that yet, Doctor," Ramirez said quickly, though her expression suggested she believed it. "But I need to report my suspicions. This is child abuse, Sophia. Medical child abuse, sometimes called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. I'm legally required to involve Child Protective Services." "No," Sophia grabbed Dr. Ramirez's hand with sudden desperation. "You can't. My father is Richard Sterling. He has more money and power than you can imagine. He'll make this go away. He'll make you go away. And then he'll make sure I never get another chance to escape. Please, you have to let me handle this differently." "You're 9 years old," Dr. Ramirez said gently. "This isn't your burden to carry alone." "But I'm not alone," Sophia realized suddenly. "There's a boy, Tommy. He figured it out before I did. He's been trying to help me. If you call child services now, my father will know someone suspects the truth. He'll cover his tracks better. We need to be smarter about this." "Doctor." Ramirez looked torn, clearly struggling between her legal obligations and the practical reality that a billionaire could indeed make problems disappear. "If I wait to file a report, you need to promise me you won't take those pills anymore. Can you hide them somehow?" "I'll find a way," Sophia promised, "and you need to document everything. Keep a record of when you're given medication, what kind of pills, who gives them to you. If you can safely collect samples without arousing suspicion, even better. We'll need evidence that will hold up even against your father's legal team." The door opened suddenly and Mrs. Pemberton walked in. Her eyes darted between Sophia and Dr. Ramirez suspiciously. "Is everything all right? The nurse said you'd requested a private consultation." "Just explaining the discharge procedures and home care instructions," Dr. Ramirez said smoothly, though Sophia noticed the doctor's hand was shaking slightly. "Miss Sterling is ready to go home tomorrow." After Dr. Ramirez left, Mrs. Pemberton stood for a long moment looking at Sophia with an expression that was difficult to read. "What did she say to you?" Mrs. Pemberton asked. "Nothing important, just doctor stuff." Sophia kept her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Mrs. Pemberton moved closer, her face suddenly inches from Sophia's. When she spoke, her voice was low and venomous. "I've been with you since you were born, Sophia. I've changed your diapers, wiped your tears, devoted my entire life to your care. I know when you're lying, and I can see it in your eyes right now. Something has changed. That doctor suspects something, doesn't she?" Sophia said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "You need to understand something," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the wheelchair's armrest. "Your father loves you. Everything he's done has been for your own good, to protect you from a world that would never understand or accept you. The medication keeps you safe. It keeps you with us. Without it, you might try to leave, and then where would you be? A 9-year-old girl alone in a cruel world." The words were meant to sound caring, but Sophia finally heard them for what they were: the twisted justification of someone who had participated in child abuse for nearly a decade. Mrs. Pemberton believed what she was saying. She genuinely thought that drugging a little girl into paralysis was an act of love. That night, after Mrs. Pemberton finally left and the hospital settled into quiet darkness, Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would return to the Sterling mansion. Tomorrow the fight would truly begin. She would have to pretend to take her medication while secretly disposing of it. She would have to hide her increasing mobility from everyone except Tommy, if she could even find a way to contact him again. But most importantly, she would have to find concrete evidence of what her father had done, medical records perhaps, or the medication itself. Something that would prove beyond doubt that Richard Sterling had knowingly and deliberately crippled his own daughter for 9 years. The task seemed impossible for a 9-year-old girl who'd never been allowed to have any independence or privacy. But as Sophia flexed her toes beneath the blankets, feeling them respond to her will for the first time in her conscious memory, she felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd forgotten its name. Hope. She wasn't paralyzed. She'd never been paralyzed. She'd been imprisoned, and now, with Tommy's help and Dr. Ramirez's knowledge and her own awakening understanding of the truth, she was going to break free, no matter what it took. 3 days had passed since Sophia returned from the hospital, and the Sterling mansion felt like it was closing in around her. She'd successfully avoided taking her full medication doses, hiding pills, pretending to swallow, spitting them into tissues when Mrs. Pemberton looked away. With each day that the drugs left her system, sensation returned to her legs in small, precious increments. Tingling became feeling. Twitches became deliberate movements. The prison walls were cracking, but so was her father's patience. Richard Sterling stood in Sophia's doorway on the 4th evening, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He'd returned early from New York, claiming business had wrapped up sooner than expected, but Sophia knew better. He'd come back because something had alerted him that his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone that made Sophia's skin crawl. The false warmth of a predator pretending to be concerned. "Fine, Daddy, just tired." Sophia kept her voice small, vulnerable, exactly what he expected from his helpless daughter. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you've been having trouble sleeping, nightmares about the hospital." He moved closer, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I've asked Dr. Morrison to prescribe something stronger, something to help you rest properly." Stronger medication. The words sent ice through Sophia's veins. They were increasing the dosages because somehow they suspected she wasn't as sedated as she should be. "I don't need anything stronger," Sophia said carefully. "The vitamins help enough." Richard's hand reached out to stroke her hair, and it took everything in Sophia not to flinch away. "I know what's best for you, Sophia. I always have. Your mother, God rest her soul, she didn't understand. She wanted to give you independence, freedom, all these abstract concepts that don't matter when you're facing a lifetime of disability. But I understand. I know that true love means protection even when it's difficult." The words were wrong in ways Sophia couldn't fully articulate, but she understood their meaning. Her father genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. In his twisted worldview, keeping her paralyzed and dependent wasn't abuse, it was love. That made him even more dangerous than if he'd simply been cruel. After he left, Sophia lay in the darkness thinking about her mother. Caroline Sterling had died when Sophia was 3 years old, supposedly in a car accident, though Sophia was beginning to wonder about that too. What if her mother had discovered what Richard was doing? What if she'd tried to stop him? The next morning brought an unexpected development. A woman Sophia had never seen before arrived at the mansion, introducing herself as Jennifer Walsh, a social worker conducting routine follow-up visits for children with disabilities. Mrs. Pemberton looked distinctly uncomfortable with the unannounced visit, but she couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. "May I speak with Sophia privately?" Jennifer asked pleasantly, her smile professional but her eyes sharp and assessing. "That's highly unusual," Mrs. Pemberton protested. "Miss Sterling requires constant supervision for her safety. I assure you I'm trained in working with children with mobility challenges. 15 minutes, Mrs. Pemberton. That's all I need." Once they were alone in the sunroom, Jennifer's demeanor changed completely. She pulled out her phone and showed Sophia a photograph. It was Tommy, standing beside a woman Sophia didn't recognize. "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm not here for a routine visit," she said quietly, urgently. "I'm a friend of Detective Sarah Martinez." A 7-year-old boy named Tommy Chen came to the police station with evidence that you're being medically abused. The detective couldn't get a warrant based on what he brought, but she asked me to do an informal welfare check. "Sophia, if you're in danger, if anything Tommy said is true, you need to tell me now." Sophia's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Someone believed Tommy. Someone was actually listening. "It's all true," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My father has been giving me drugs since I was 3 years old, to keep me paralyzed, so he can control my mother's trust fund." Jennifer's face remained calm, but Sophia saw her hands tighten on her notebook. "That's an extremely serious allegation. Do you have any proof?" "I've been collecting the pills when I can hide them. They're in my jewelry box. And I took pictures of documents in my father's office, legal papers about my mother's money. There's a camera hidden under my mattress." Jennifer quickly retrieved both items, her movements efficient and professional. She photographed the pills with her phone and copied the images from Sophia's camera. "This is good, Sophia. This is really good. But I need to ask you something important. If I report this, if we move forward with an investigation, your father will know. Things might get worse before they get better. Are you prepared for that?" "It's already getting worse," Sophia said. "They're increasing my medication because they think I'm becoming too aware. Last night my father talked about even stronger drugs. Miss Walsh, if someone doesn't help me soon, I'm afraid they're going to give me something I can't wake up from." Jennifer's expression hardened with determination. "That's not going to happen. I'm going to take this directly to Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. With this evidence, we can get an emergency protective order. But Sophia, you need to be very careful until then. Can you pretend to take the medication, hide it somehow?" "I've been trying, but they're watching me more closely. Mrs. Pemberton is crushing the pills into food now. It's getting harder." "Then take as little as you can manage without making them suspicious. Keep yourself as alert as possible. And if anything happens, if you feel like you're in immediate danger, call 911. Don't hesitate. Your safety is more important than the investigation." After Jennifer left, Sophia felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine hope mixed with terrifying fear. Help was coming. But would it arrive in time? That afternoon, Sophia received another unexpected visitor. An elderly woman in an elegant pantsuit appeared at her door, introducing herself as Margaret Sterling, Sophia's paternal grandmother. Sophia had only met her a handful of times in her life. Her father claimed Margaret was too frail for regular visits, though looking at the sharp-eyed woman before her, Sophia suspected that was another lie. "Leave us," Margaret commanded Mrs. Pemberton with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. Mr. Sterling gave strict instructions. "I don't recall asking for your opinion. Leave. Now." Once they were alone, Margaret studied Sophia with an intensity that made her squirm. "You look like your mother," she said finally. "Caroline was the best thing that ever happened to my son, and the worst thing he ever did was marry her." "I don't understand," Sophia said carefully. No, I suppose you wouldn't. Margaret settled into a chair with a heavy sigh. Sophia, I'm here because someone contacted me. A police detective asking questions about your medical history, about your mother's death, about the family finances. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing documents I should have looked at years ago, and I'm discovering things that horrify me. Sophia's breath caught. What kind of things? Your mother's trust fund, the one she established for you. I helped her set it up, actually, at her request. She wanted to ensure you'd always be independent, never trapped by financial dependence on anyone, even your father. But after she died, Richard took control as your guardian. And according to the trust documents, he only maintains that control as long as you're deemed incompetent to manage your own affairs. I know, Sophia whispered. I found the papers. That's why he's been keeping me like this, so he can keep the money. Margaret's face crumpled with something that looked like grief and guilt combined. I should have paid more attention. I should have visited more, but Richard said you were too fragile, that seeing visitors upset you, that you needed complete stability and routine. I believed him because he's my son and I wanted to believe the best of him. But the detective who contacted me asked about your medication history, and when I reviewed your medical records I hadn't looked at in years, I found inconsistencies, prescriptions that don't match your supposed condition, doctors with questionable credentials, and most damningly, I found correspondence between your father and his attorney discussing how to have you declared permanently incompetent when you turn 18. Can you help me? Sophia asked, tears streaming down her face. Everyone says my father is too powerful, that he has too much money and influence, but you're his mother. People would listen to you. Margaret reached out and took Sophia's hand, the first genuinely affectionate touch from a family member that Sophia could remember. I'm going to do more than help you, sweetheart. I'm going to tear down everything Richard has built on your suffering. Money means nothing if it comes at the cost of a child's freedom. Your mother trusted me to look after you if anything happened to her, and I failed, but I won't fail you again. That evening, as Sophia lay in bed, supposedly sleeping, she heard raised voices from downstairs. Her father and grandmother were arguing, their words carrying through the old mansion's heating vents. You will stop this investigation immediately, Richard's voice sharp with fury. I will do no such thing. Sophia is my granddaughter, Richard, my blood, and I will not stand by while you destroy her life for money. That money should be mine. Caroline had no right to lock it away, to treat me like I couldn't be trusted. And she was correct not to trust you. Look what you've done. You've poisoned a child, your own daughter. I've protected her. The world is cruel to people like Sophia. I've kept her safe, kept her from a life of struggle and disappointment. You've kept her imprisoned, and for what? $50 million you don't even need. You're already wealthy, Richard. This was never about money. This was about control. About punishing Caroline for not trusting you by taking away the one thing she left behind, our granddaughter's freedom. The argument continued, but Sophia had heard enough. Her grandmother knew everything and was willing to fight. Jennifer Walsh had evidence and was contacting authorities. Tommy had never stopped trying to help her. The cage was cracking wider, but cages were most dangerous when they were breaking. Trapped animals fought hardest when they sensed escape, and Richard Sterling was nothing if not a fighter. Sophia drifted into uneasy sleep. Her last conscious thought a prayer that help would arrive before her father decided the risk of keeping her conscious was too great. That night she dreamed of running, not through gardens or fields, but through darkness, always hearing footsteps behind her, always afraid of being caught and dragged back to the wheelchair that had defined her entire life. She woke to find Mrs. Pemberton standing over her bed holding a syringe and realized with ice-cold terror that her nightmare was about to become reality. "What are you doing?" Sophia's voice came out small and frightened as she stared at the syringe in Mrs. Pemberton's hand. The room was dark except for the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting everything in shades of grey that made the scene feel unreal, nightmarish. "Your father's orders," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice strangely flat. "After his argument with your grandmother tonight, he's decided we can't take any more risks. This will keep you calm and comfortable until everything is resolved." "What's in that?" Sophia tried to push herself up, but Mrs. Pemberton's hand came down firmly on her shoulder. "Something to help you sleep. For a long time. Your father assures me it's perfectly safe. You'll simply be unconscious for a few weeks while he handles the current complications. When you wake up, everything will be back to normal." A few weeks unconscious. By the time Sophia woke, if she woke, any investigation would be shut down, any witnesses intimidated into silence, any evidence disappeared. Richard Sterling would have won, and Sophia would be trapped forever. "Please don't do this," Sophia begged, genuine terror making her voice shake. "Mrs. Pemberton, you've known me since I was 3 years old. You've taken care of me every single day. Please, I'm begging you." For just a moment, something flickered across Mrs. Pemberton's face. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of the conscience she'd buried years ago. But then it hardened back into determination. "This is for your own good, Sophia. You don't understand now, but someday you'll thank me for protecting you from yourself." The words were almost identical to what Richard had said earlier, and Sophia realized with sickening clarity that Mrs. Pemberton genuinely believed she was helping. She'd convinced herself that keeping Sophia paralyzed and dependent was an act of love, of protection. The delusion made her infinitely more dangerous than simple cruelty would have. As Mrs. Pemberton reached for Sophia's arm to inject the medication, Sophia made a desperate decision. She actually kicked with both legs, movement that should have been impossible for someone supposedly paralyzed since birth. The kick caught Mrs. Pemberton in the stomach, not hard enough to injure, but shocking enough to make her stumble backward. The syringe fell from her hand, rolling under the bed. Pemberton's face transformed from determination to absolute horror as she processed what had just happened. "You can move," she whispered, backing away as if Sophia had suddenly become dangerous. "You can actually move. How long? How long have you been able to?" "I've always been able to," Sophia said, pushing herself to a sitting position despite her shaking arms. "Every single day that you gave me those pills, you were poisoning someone who could walk, someone who could run, someone who was completely healthy except for what you were doing to her." Mrs. Pemberton's face crumpled. No, that's not possible. You were diagnosed at birth. The doctors said—" "The doctors lied, or they were paid to lie. And you helped, Mrs. Pemberton. You helped steal 9 years of my life." Before Mrs. Pemberton could respond, the bedroom door burst open. Margaret Sterling stood there in an elegant robe, her phone in her hand. "Step away from my granddaughter," she commanded with steel in her voice. "Now." "Mrs. Sterling, I was just administering her evening medication." "I heard everything," Margaret interrupted. "I've been standing outside this door recording on my phone for the past 5 minutes. I have you on video threatening to forcibly sedate a child, and I have Sophia demonstrating mobility that shouldn't exist if she's truly paralyzed. Mrs. Pemberton, you're going to leave this room immediately and wait in the kitchen for the police, who I called 10 minutes ago." "The police?" Mrs. Pemberton's face went white. "But Mr. Sterling said, 'I don't care what my son said. He's not above the law, and neither are you.'" Mrs. Pemberton fled, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Margaret moved to Sophia's side, her hands gentle as she checked for injuries. "Are you all right? Did she inject you with anything?" "No. You got here in time." Sophia was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. "How did you know?" "I didn't sleep after my argument with Richard. Something felt wrong, dangerous. So I stayed awake, watching the security monitors. Yes, your father has cameras throughout the house, though he doesn't know I have access to them. When I saw Mrs. Pemberton enter your room with a syringe, I knew I had to act immediately." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Margaret wrapped a blanket around Sophia's shoulders. "The police are coming. So is an ambulance. You're going to be taken somewhere safe tonight, somewhere your father can't reach you. And tomorrow we're going to make sure he never has the chance to hurt you again." "What about you?" Sophia asked. "He's your son. Won't you get in trouble for going against him?" Margaret's expression was fierce. "He stopped being the son I raised the moment he decided money was worth more than his daughter's life. I'll deal with whatever consequences come. You just focus on staying strong a little longer." The next hour passed in a blur. Police officers filled the Sterling mansion, led by Detective Sarah Martinez, the woman who had listened to Tommy days earlier. Mrs. Pemberton was arrested on charges of child abuse and attempted assault. Richard Sterling, trying to flee through a back entrance, was caught by officers stationed around the property and taken into custody despite his protests and threats. Sophia was taken to Boston Children's Hospital in an ambulance, but this time not as a patient being returned to her abuser, as a survivor being placed under protective custody. Dr. Ramirez met them at the emergency room entrance, her face tight with concern and determination. "We're going to take good care of you," Dr. Ramirez promised as they wheeled Sophia inside. "And this time, you're safe. Truly safe." In a small hospital room 3 floors above the emergency department, Sophia finally allowed herself to break down. She sobbed for the 9 years stolen from her, for the father who had chosen money over love, for the mother she barely remembered who had tried to protect her, even after death. Dr. Ramirez sat beside her, holding her hand and letting her cry until there were no tears left. "What happens now?" Sophia asked when she could finally speak again. "Now you heal," Dr. Ramirez said gently. "Physically, emotionally, all of it. We'll work on strengthening your legs. They're weak from years of induced paralysis, but the early signs are promising. We'll also connect you with therapists who specialize in trauma. And legally there will be investigations, probably a trial. Your father will face justice for what he's done. Will I have to testify? Possibly, but you won't be alone. Your grandmother has already hired one of the best family law attorneys in Massachusetts, and there's a little boy named Tommy who's been asking about you constantly. Would you like to see him?" Sophia nodded through her tears. Minutes later, Tommy burst into the room, his mother Lin Chen behind him trying to slow him down. When he saw Sophia, really saw her, safe and awake and finally free, his face split into the biggest smile Sophia had ever seen. "You're okay," Tommy breathed, rushing to her bedside. "I was so scared. When the police came to tell us what happened, I thought maybe we were too late." "You saved me," Sophia said, reaching for his hand. "Tommy, you never gave up even when nobody believed you." "Detective Martinez believed me eventually," Tommy said. "And your grandmother believed you, and now everyone's going to know the truth." Over the following days, the truth indeed came out. Forensic accountants discovered Richard Sterling had been siphoning money from Sophia's trust fund for years through fraudulent expenses. Medical experts reviewed Sophia's records and concluded she'd been systematically poisoned with neuromuscular blocking agents since age 3. Mrs. Pemberton, facing decades in prison, agreed to testify against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Rebecca, the young housekeeper who had helped Sophia communicate with Tommy, came forward with years of observations, suspicious medication schedules, overheard conversations, Richard's cold treatment of Sophia when no cameras were present. Her testimony painted a picture of calculated, deliberate abuse that even Richard's expensive lawyers couldn't refute. 1 week after her rescue, Sophia was moved from the hospital to a temporary foster home while the legal situation was resolved. Her grandmother had petitioned for custody, but that would take time to process through the courts. In the meantime, Sophia lived with a foster family who specialized in caring for children recovering from medical trauma. The foster mother, Patricia Reeves, was a former physical therapist with warm eyes and infinite patience. "We're going to take this one day at a time," she told Sophia on her first day. "Some days will be good. Some days will be hard, but every single day you'll be making progress toward being the person you were always meant to be." The physical therapy was brutal. 9 years of forced immobility had left Sophia's legs weak and uncoordinated. Learning to walk properly felt like learning an entirely new skill. But Patricia worked with her every day, celebrating small victories, standing unaided for 30 seconds, taking 3 steps without support, walking the length of the hallway. Tommy visited twice a week, always bringing stories about school or funny things his mother had said, or updates about the case against Richard Sterling. His presence reminded Sophia that she wasn't alone, that someone had cared enough to fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself. 2 months into her recovery, Sophia stood in front of a mirror and didn't recognize the girl looking back. This version of herself stood upright on her own legs. Her eyes held determination instead of resignation. She looked stronger, healthier, more alive than the girl who had lived in the Sterling mansion. "Ready for the big day tomorrow?" Patricia asked, appearing in the doorway. Tomorrow was Richard Sterling's trial. Sophia would testify about what her father had done to her. The thought terrified her, but it also felt necessary. The final step in reclaiming her story from the man who had tried to write it for her. "I'm ready," Sophia said, and realized she meant it. The courthouse was imposing, all marble columns and formal proceedings that made 9-year-old Sophia feel very small, but she wasn't alone. Her grandmother sat beside her holding her hand. Tommy and his mother were in the gallery, offering supportive smiles, and Patricia Reeves, her foster mother, had positioned herself directly in Sophia's line of sight, ready to provide comfort if needed. Richard Sterling entered the courtroom in a designer suit, looking every bit the successful businessman he'd always been. But his eyes, when they met Sophia's across the room, held something new, not love or even fake concern. Just cold calculation, as if she were a business problem he needed to solve. The prosecutor, District Attorney Helen Morrison, approached Sophia's seat with gentle professionalism. "Are you ready, Sophia? Remember, just tell the truth about what happened. Take your time, and if you need a break, just let me know." Sophia nodded, her throat tight with nerves. When they called her to the witness stand, she walked there on her own 2 legs, a powerful statement that required no words. The jury watched her progress, with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright anger. "Sophia," D.A. Morrison began once she was sworn in, "can you tell us about your earliest memories of being in a wheelchair?" "I don't really remember being in it at first," Sophia said, her voice small but clear. "My earliest concrete memory is from when I was maybe 5 years old, but I have these other memories, like dreams, of running and walking. For a long time, I thought they were just fantasies, but now I think they were real memories from before." "Before what?" "Before my father started giving me the medication that made me unable to walk." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richard Sterling's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him, allowing Sophia to continue. Over the next 2 hours, Sophia told her story. She described the daily routine of medication, how Mrs. Pemberton would personally administer the pills, how she'd been told her entire life that she was born paralyzed. She explained about discovering the truth in the hospital, about collecting pills as evidence, about finding the legal documents that revealed her father's financial motive. "Sophia," D.A. Morrison asked carefully, "can you tell the jury how you felt when you realized your father had been deliberately keeping you paralyzed?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment, searching for words adequate to describe the betrayal. "It felt like my whole life was a lie. Like the person who was supposed to love me most in the world had decided I wasn't worth loving as a real person, only as a thing he could control to get what he wanted." Her voice broke. "I felt like I didn't matter, like 9 years of my life didn't matter." Several jury members wiped their eyes. Even the judge looked affected. Richard Sterling's defense was predictable. His lawyers argued that Sophia had indeed been born with a degenerative condition, that the medications were prescribed by licensed physicians, that Richard had acted in good faith as a devoted father trying to manage his daughter's care. They painted him as a victim of overzealous investigators and a confused child who misunderstood her own medical history. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical experts testified that the drugs found in Sophia's system would cause temporary paralysis in a healthy person. Financial experts showed how Richard had been illegally accessing Sophia's trust fund for years. Margaret Sterling took the stand and described Richard's cold calculation when discussing Sophia's incompetence and how it benefited him financially. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Morrison, the physician who had administered Sophia's medications for 6 years. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, and he held nothing back. "Richard Sterling told me explicitly that Sophia needed to remain manageable," Dr. Morrison testified, his voice heavy with guilt. "He said that if she ever became too independent or questioned her situation, we needed to increase the dosages. He called it maintaining the baseline. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was harming a child, but he paid me $300,000 a year to keep silent. And I told myself I was helping her, because the alternative, facing what I was really doing, was too horrible to accept. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of someone crying softly in the gallery. When it came time for Richard Sterling himself to testify, he maintained his innocence with practiced ease. He spoke eloquently about the challenges of raising a disabled child alone after his wife's death, about his commitment to finding treatments and therapies, about his pain at being accused of harming the daughter he loved. But during cross-examination, D.A. Morrison asked a single question that shattered his carefully constructed defense. "Mr. Sterling, if your daughter was born paralyzed as you claim, why did you wait until after your wife's death to begin her medication regimen? Why are there no prescriptions for these drugs during the first 3 years of Sophia's life, when your wife was still alive?" Richard Sterling's face went blank. His lawyers objected frantically, but the damage was done. The jury had seen him stumble, seen the moment when his lies caught up with him. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with their verdict, Sophia was in the courtroom to hear it. On the charge of child abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of unlawful administration of controlled substances, we find the defendant guilty. The list continued. Guilty on all 17 counts. Richard Sterling showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Sophia felt something break free inside her chest. A weight she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge addressed Richard Sterling directly. "You took advantage of a child's vulnerability and trust for financial gain. You stole not just money, but years of your daughter's life. You betrayed the fundamental duty of a parent to protect and nurture their child. The court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. 30 years. By the time Richard Sterling was released, Sophia would be almost 40 years old enough to have built an entire life he couldn't touch. After the sentencing, Margaret Sterling officially received custody of Sophia. They moved into a comfortable home in Cambridge, close enough to Boston for Sophia's continued physical therapy, but far enough from the Sterling estate that Sophia didn't have to see reminders of her past every day. The recovery process took 2 full years. Sophia worked with physical therapists to rebuild strength in muscles that had been unused for 9 years. She saw trauma counselors to process the psychological impact of what had been done to her. She attended regular school for the first time, making friends who knew her as Sophia. Not the Sterling heiress, not the girl in the wheelchair, just Sophia. Tommy remained a constant presence in her life. His friendship had saved her, and that bond proved unbreakable. They attended the same school, studied together, and spent weekends exploring Boston with the freedom of children who understood how precious that freedom truly was. On Sophia's 11th birthday, exactly 2 years after her father's conviction, she did something she'd been planning for months. She organized a 5K charity run to raise money for children recovering from medical abuse. The event drew hundreds of participants, including media coverage that turned Sophia's story into a national conversation about medical child abuse and the need for better oversight. Standing at the starting line, Sophia looked around at the crowd. Her grandmother was there, cheering loudly. Patricia Reeves, who had transitioned from foster mother to family friend, wore a race bib with Sophia's picture on it. Tommy stood beside Sophia at the starting line, grinning with excitement. "This is pretty cool," Tommy said, bouncing on his toes. "You went from not being able to walk to organizing a whole race. We went from you being a kid nobody listened to you being the reason this race exists," Sophia corrected. "Everything that happened, everything good that came after the bad, started because you refused to give up on me." When the starting gun fired, they ran together. Sophia's stride had improved dramatically with therapy, though it would probably never be perfectly smooth. But she was running. Actually running. The autumn air filled her lungs, the ground was solid beneath her feet, and for the first time in her life, Sophia felt completely, joyfully free. She didn't win the race, that wasn't the point. But as she crossed the finish line with Tommy beside her, both of them laughing and out of breath, Sophia realized she'd won something much more important. She'd won her life back. She'd won the right to write her own story instead of living in someone else's twisted narrative. That evening, exhausted and happy, Sophia sat with her grandmother on their porch watching the sunset. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up," Sophia said. "Oh? And what's that?" "I want to be a lawyer, someone who helps kids like me, kids who are trapped and don't know how to get free. I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Margaret smiled, pride evident in her expression. "Your mother would be so proud of you. She always said you'd be strong enough to change the world. I think she was right." Sophia thought about the mother she barely remembered, about the trust fund Caroline had set up to ensure her daughter's independence, about how that single act of protection had ultimately led to 9 years of abuse, but had also provided the resources for Sophia's recovery. Her mother had tried to save her even after death, and in a way she had. "Grandma," Sophia asked quietly, "do you think Mom knew that Dad would try to hurt me?" Margaret was silent for a long time. "I think your mother understood that Richard valued control more than he valued people. I think that's why she created the trust the way she did, to protect you from that need for control. She just didn't anticipate how far he'd go to break that protection. Do you think she'd forgive me for being the reason he went to prison? He's your son, and I—" "Stop right there," Margaret interrupted firmly. "You are not responsible for your father's choices. He chose greed over love. He chose control over his daughter's well-being. Those were his decisions, and he's paying the consequences. Your mother would be proud of your strength in surviving and speaking truth. And so am I." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sophia felt the last piece of guilt she'd been carrying dissolve. She wasn't responsible for the abuse. She wasn't responsible for the consequences her father faced. She was simply a survivor who had found the courage to tell her truth. Over the following years, Sophia flourished in ways that would have seemed impossible during her years in the wheelchair. She excelled academically, making honor roll every semester. She joined the debate team and discovered she had a talent for arguing her point, a skill that would serve her well in her future legal career. She made genuine friends who valued her for who she was, rather than what she represented. Tommy continued to be her closest friend and fiercest supporter. They were different in many ways. He was outgoing where she was reserved, impulsive where she was thoughtful, but they shared something deeper than personality traits. They shared the knowledge that they had faced darkness together and emerged stronger for it. On the day Sophia graduated from middle school at age 13, she gave a speech as class valedictorian. Standing before her classmates and their families, she spoke about resilience, about the power of speaking up when something is wrong, about the importance of believing children when they say they need help. "I spent 9 years of my life in a wheelchair I didn't need," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Someone who was supposed to protect me chose to hurt me instead. But I also learned that there are people who will fight for you even when they barely know you. People like my friend Tommy, who refused to accept that what he was seeing was normal. People like the doctors and social workers who listened when I told them my truth. People like my grandmother, who chose justice over family loyalty when it mattered most. We all have the power to be that person for someone else. We all have the power to notice when something is wrong and to do something about it. That's the lesson I want to share with you today. Not that bad things happen, but that good people can make them stop." The applause was thunderous. Tommy, sitting in the front row, was crying openly. Tears of pride and joy for his friend who had come so far from the lonely girl in the garden who had once asked if he thought she could really walk. After the ceremony, as Sophia stood with her grandmother and friends taking photographs, she caught sight of a news van in the parking lot. Her story had never completely left the public consciousness. It had sparked important conversations about medical child abuse, about financial exploitation of children, about the need for better oversight of children with disabilities. A reporter approached respectfully. "Sophia, now that you're graduating and moving forward with your life, how do you feel about what happened? Do you have any message for other children who might be experiencing similar abuse?" Sophia considered the question carefully. "I think the most important message is that you're not crazy. If something feels wrong, if the adults in your life are hurting you, trust yourself. You deserve to be believed and you deserve to be safe. And to the adults, listen to children. Really listen. Because sometimes they're telling you about something terrible that you have the power to stop. That night, as Sophia prepared for bed in the room she'd decorated herself, so different from the carefully curated space in the Sterling mansion, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back was taller now, stronger, more confident. Scars remained, psychological ones that therapy helped but couldn't completely erase, and physical ones in the form of legs that still ached sometimes from the damage done by years of forced paralysis. But she was here. She was alive. She was free. And she was determined to use her freedom to help others find theirs. Sophia Sterling had been a victim. She'd been trapped, poisoned, betrayed by the person who should have loved her most. But she had also been brave. She had survived. And she had transformed her pain into purpose. The girl who couldn't walk had learned to run, and she wasn't stopping now.